This quote is from your book, page 61. You say that Paul actually agreed with the authorities in Jerusalem that genital circumcision remained the defining indicator of Jewish identity. But in the wake of Christ, he believed that circumcision would now be performed by Christ, not by men.
Yeah.
So why did Paul circumcise Timothy? Because he was Jewish, so he thought it was. So, in other words,
yeah.
if Christ is the agent of circumcision, is that just for Gentiles?
Right. So this is a big question, and this is something I addressed in my second book.
Yeah. Dr. Garroway, I'm gonna. Sorry to cut you off real quick.
Yeah.
I just want to add this quote to the context of the question.
Sure. Yeah. Go ahead.
This is from Mark Nanos. I believe he's also a Jewish Pauline scholar.
He is,
and this is from the annotated the Jewish annotated New Testament. He says this statement, and he's talking about 1 Corinthians 9, where Paul says, "To the Jew I become like a Jew, to the Gentile I become like a Gentile, to those under the law I become like one under the law." Although he says, "I myself am not under the law," which is a really interesting statement. But anyway, Mark Nano says this statement has overwhelmingly been read to mean that Paul compromised Torah observance to become like non-Jews in order to gain them to Christ, as well as to mimic the behavior of Torah observant Jews to win them. But Paul does not write that he behaves like each one he seeks to gain. Rather, he explains that he relates rhetorically to each according to the premises from which each works. I don't know if I agree with this. And I'm wondering if the example of Timothy is an example of him placating his Jewish brothers and sisters. What do you think?
Okay. Well, now you've added a second mare's nest. So, okay, let me just say, first of all, that I know Mark. I like Mark. I've hung out with Mark many times. Mark and I do not see eye to eye on how Paul should be read. Which is not to say I don't have tremendous respect for Mark and his work.
Sure.
But this is the beauty of scholarship of ancient texts. People can come to very different conclusions, and Mark and I do. So let me kind of bracket Mark for a second and get to Timothy. There's two questions that have to be asked. One is, did Paul actually circumcise Timothy? Right. Acts says that Paul circumcised Timothy, but Acts is not necessarily historically accurate, in my opinion. I actually think it's more accurate than a lot of other people do. But just because Acts says Paul circumcised Timothy does not mean Paul circumcised Timothy. Second question is, if Paul did circumcise Timothy, or it's a funny way to put it, Paul insists that Timothy was circumcised. I'm not sure Paul was actually wielding the knife. But if Paul did circumcise Timothy, when did Paul circumcise Timothy? Is it possible that Acts knows that Paul circumcised Timothy, but Luke puts it into the narrative at a particular point that is strategic? And so I don't want to get too much into what I wrote about in my second book, but what I argue very in brief in that second book is that Paul, in the first 6 or so years of his career after his conversion, which I put in scare quotes on purpose, after Paul became to believe that Christ was indeed resurrected, in my opinion, in those first 6 years, Paul circumcised the Gentiles. That is why for example, Galatians 5, Paul says, if I'm still circumcising Gentiles, why am I being persecuted? Because my argument in that second book is that Paul, in the first part of his career, was a part of Antiochene missions to Gentiles that included circumcision. And that it was only a third of the way through his career, I argue, I think in the year 42, I may be off by a year, that Paul had a second revelation in which he came to believe that, in fact, no, you're supposed to be preaching to Gentiles without circumcision or law observance. And so what I argue in the second book is that Timothy was circumcised by Paul because Timothy, who was from Lystra, was from Turkey, that Paul circumcised Timothy in that first phase of Paul's career. And Luke knew that. But then Luke deliberately delays describing that circumcision of Timothy in order to not give it apostolic precedence or even to suggest that Paul was doing this before the Jerusalem conference.
Mm-hmm.
And so Luke delays reporting it until after the Jerusalem conference, when the whole matter of circumcision is sealed. And then Luke can make it, oh, Paul just did this because he didn't want to get in trouble when he was walking through Turkey, or whatever the excuse is there. So in the second book, I do have an explanation for why I think Paul did circumcise Timothy and why Luke reports it where he reports it after the Jerusalem conference.
Interesting.
But as for this quote, no, I think that Paul did not see himself as obedient to the law, as opposed to Mark and a variety of other new perspective on Paul scholars. And I tend to view 1 Corinthians 9, maybe in an old-fashioned way, that what Paul is describing here is his perspective on maybe what we would call adiaphora, and the importance of rhetorical situation, and what my friend Kevin Concannon would call ethnic malleability. That he says at the end of the day, what really matters is convincing people of Christ's resurrection and getting them baptized. And if I'm around Jews, if I need to play up the Jewish angle to make that happen, I do it. And if I'm around Gentiles, if I need to play up the Gentile angle to make that happen, I do it. Because for him, all of that other stuff is ultimately adiaphora. It doesn't matter. What matters is convincing them of the truth of the gospel.
Okay, so you do see that statement in 1 Corinthians 9 as having to do with rhetoric, then, not so much altering behavior.
No, I do think he would have altered me. I think that if he was going to a synagogue in Corinth, he would have eaten the way the people in the synagogue in Corinth eat.
Gotcha.
And if he was at a rich person Gentile's house in Corinth, and they were eating meat from the temple of Artemis, Asclepius, I don't know, whatever, he would have eaten that. And he would have said it doesn't matter.
So what if there's Jews and Gentiles in the same space? This is completely hypothetical. I acknowledge that.
Yeah.
I'm just trying to get into the mind of Paul. Then what would he do?